Over the last few years, I tried and used many different focusing methods, ranging from your typical autofocus to manual zone focusing and everything in between. Having gone through many frustrating experiences, countless mistakes, and a few key turning points where I've realized what I was doing wrong, I finally put together a focusing system that I've been using for quite a while with a high degree of accuracy, and today I want to share that with you. So be it walking through a busy market, trying to do street photography, or doing a slower paced cityscape towards the end of the day, this system will have you covered. Please keep in mind that there is no one way of doing it. There are many different ways of focusing, and the healthiest approach that you can have is to listen to what I have to say, try it, pick out what works, delete what doesn't work, listen to someone else, do the same, and over time you will build your own little system based on things that you find and based on things that you hear from a selection of different people. You've probably heard of back button focusing. There are people out there who swear by it and are very vocal regarding how amazing it is, and equally there are another group of people who literally just don't get the point of it. Well, just like everything in photography, it's not a simple A or B answer because it entirely depends on your subject, on your conditions, and ultimately on your end goal. From personal experience, I would only use 100% back button focusing if I was shooting fast moving subjects, be it wildlife or sports or anything of that nature. The main reason for it is because with back button focusing I can keep the autofocus continuous locked in and then just take bursts of photos as and when I need without interfering with the autofocus system. For those types of shots it's ideal. However, for street photography and cityscapes and general city and travel stuff, I think it can be a little bit too much. Personally, I found having the focus on the shutter as your camera comes with was a lot more intuitive, and certainly I got a lot more results from focusing that way compared to only back button focus. A few examples is wearing thick gloves in the winter. Also, if I want the camera a bit lower down, let's say around chest level, I can use my thumb to then focus and take the photo without having to reach around the back of the camera to activate the focusing that way. However, there are certain scenarios where I've found that temporarily detaching the focusing from the shutter button and moving it to the back of the camera proved to be very useful, matter of fact, invaluable. So I found a way to have the best of both worlds, and honestly most cameras will allow you to do that, and we'll talk more about that later in the video. Most cameras will have two types of autofocusing systems. The first one is autofocus single, and as the name suggests, it means that when you acquire focus on your subject, that focus is locked as long as you're still pressing the shutter button or half pressing the shutter button. So if you take a step forward or your subject takes a step forward or backwards, then technically you will no longer be in focus because the distance has changed and the camera has not sort of refocused for the new distance. This is a very popular setting where people shoot with focus and recompose. So they will focus on, let's say, the background, recompose the camera, have the foreground slightly out of focus, and take the photo. I'll be honest, I don't use this mode all that much because of a few, let's say, settings that I'll talk about later in the video. However, when I do use it is if I'm only shooting still life and if I don't need to constantly change focusing mode. So let's say I'm only shooting architecture and I'll know for the next 3 hours I won't shoot anything else, then I will probably leave it in autofocus single, because unless a building moves, unlikely, or unless I move, which means I've made a mistake, then the focus shouldn't change all that much. I'll sometimes use this in some nature and cityscapes as well, as long as it's a very clear day and there is no fog or haze that can potentially throw the focusing system off. There is a way to get around it, but again, I'll talk about that later in the video. Continuous autofocus simply means that the camera will track whatever it is that you're focusing on as long as the shutter button is half pressed or the back button of the camera is pressed. So if you take a step forward or your subject takes a step forward or backwards, the camera will readjust the focus to make sure that the subject is always in focus. Now, for me, doing street photography, I use this about 90% of the time because in most cases, the environment is very dynamic. You are walking, you can quickly take a photo whilst you're walking. Even if you stop, chances are the people within your shot are moving around as well. And just from personal experience, I've had a much better hit rate having the camera in autofocus continuous. However, it does come with a few drawbacks and a few issues. So if you're, let's say, shooting a still object like a building or a landscape or a cityscape or even a plant pot, some continuous autofocus systems can hunt around because even though the subject is still, the system is kind of expecting some movement. So especially in earlier systems, you'll find that even though you've acquired focus, now and again there'll be a very minute kind of hunt where it just tries to reacquire the focus or make sure that it's still in focus. Now, most of the time this is not a big issue, especially on more modern cameras. However, if you take a photo and you just time it badly with the camera kind of hunting for that focus, you can end up with an out of focus image. Another issue comes with focusing and recomposing. So sometimes I want to focus on the background or on the subject and then maybe recompose the camera, or maybe even have the background in focus and just wait for the right, let's say, bus or taxi or person to go through the frame. I've had it many times where I left it obviously in continuous autofocus, and by the time I took the photo, the camera actually tried to switch from the background to the subject, and sometimes the subject was in focus, or sometimes nothing was in focus because the camera was kind of halfway through switching. So this can obviously catch you out if you forget that you are in continuous autofocus. Now, to avoid this, many people will switch the camera either into full manual or even back into single autofocus, which will of course fix all of these issues. However, another issue happens, and maybe this is just me because I'm a bit thick, but let's say if you're in a really busy place and there's loads going on and you just get distracted easily by your environment, if you've switched it into manual, I don't know about you, but there's been many times, more than I can count, where I forgot to switch it back into continuous autofocus, which meant that the following 30-40 minutes of walking around taking photos were, as you've guessed it, blurry. Now, you could say it's just user error, I need to be less stupid, but I don't know. I think if you are in a very cool place and your eyes are like that, especially if it's a new place, it's very easily done. Of course, this is not ideal. However, thankfully, there is a way to get around this issue. Most cameras will come with an AF on button located at the back of the camera, which traditionally you would use for back button focusing. By default, this will obviously be set to focus. However, because we're doing all our focusing with the shutter button instead, we can reprogram the AF on button to something that's a lot more powerful. Although this feature is present on the X-T4 and probably most Fuji cameras, I am sure that any other decent mainstream camera will have something similar in place as well. In the custom functions menu, when you can assign what each button does, if you scroll down to the AF on button and change that to AF lock only. To put simply, when you press and hold the AF on button with AF lock only assigned, the camera will lock the focusing in whatever condition that it's in at the time you press and hold that button. Furthermore, it will detach the focusing from the shutter button, so your shutter will only take the photo and lock the exposure when half pressed. The moment you release the AF on button, everything resets back to normal and you go back into continuous autofocus. So what does this all mean in a real world application? Well, let's say you're walking through a busy market. Obviously, you'll have continuous autofocus on so that you can track any changes between you and your subject and ensure the best possible focus. However, let's say you turn around and there's a really nice building that you want to take a photo of, but obviously you want to make sure it's pin sharp. Well, the moment you focus on the building, just press and hold the AF on button, you know it's locked, take the photo, let go of everything, and then you're back in continuous autofocus. Similar for focusing and recomposing. Let's say you want to take a particular photo, but you can only achieve it with achieve the look that you want by doing focus and recompose. Well, rather than switching the camera into manual or into single and forgetting about it later, leave it in continuous, focus on what you want, lock that focus, recompose, take the photo, and then let go of the AF on button to effectively be back in full continuous autofocus. Last but not least, we have the old school way of focusing, which is of course manual. Some people swear by this and use the traditional zone focusing method with manual. I'll be honest, I tried it, it just wasn't for me, I didn't get on with it. For general use, I prefer autofocus. However, there are certain scenarios where manual is the way to go and is better than anything I've talked about so far. Those scenarios are when the visibility is not very good, so fog or haze, or you're taking photos of something that is in the extreme distance, or you're locked off on a tripod and you want to take the most pin sharp cityscape or still life image possible. That's where manual comes in. So the way I use manual is obviously put the camera into manual. I can then use the back button focus, the AF on button, to lock focus automatically on what I think should be in focus. Then on the Fujis, if you press the rear dial, you will punch in digitally into your scene, and then you can see much closer how it looks. And then you can just adjust the focus manually on the lens to basically get it pin sharp to your eyes. Press that the rear dial again and you're in focus. Take photos to your heart's content and you know that overall you'll have a very good focus. And finally, the last thing to talk about when it comes to focusing is what type of autofocus are you going to use? So specifically spot, zone, or maybe all wide or tracking, depending on what your camera calls it. For street, travel, and even nature photography, I will use either zone or single spot. The wide tracking feature, personally, I've just not found a use for it within this type of photography. However, I'm sure if you're doing loads of sports or wildlife, it becomes invaluable in those scenarios. Let's start with spot, which, as the name suggests, is a small square and a single spot of your frame where the camera will look to focus and acquire focus. You can change on most cameras the size of the spot. I recommend to have it on the smaller side because that will just increase your accuracy. And accuracy is kind of the key word here, because the main reason you would use spot is because it's a lot more accurate, because you can be a lot more precise with where the camera focuses. Now, it does have its downsides because it's so small and it's just one spot. It means that the camera will just have a harder time to acquire focus in that area. However, when it does acquire focus, it is a lot more precise. So I would use this for still life, for architecture. I will even use it for moving subjects and moving scenes in the frame, as long as I am far enough away and they're not moving around too fast and I'm expecting them to come. So let's say if I've got a bus or a taxi or a boat or something coming towards me in the distance and I have plenty of time to react, then I would use spot because it'll be a little bit more accurate. Next up is zone focus. And again, just don't be confused between this zone focus and what I've talked about earlier in manual. This zone focus basically means that instead of having one spot, you have a collection of spots within a zone. That zone will typically be just a larger square, and on the Fujis, for example, the small zone will have 9 separate focus points. So with this, when you put that zone in a particular part of the frame, the camera will try and focus on the first thing that it sees within that zone, and it has 9 focus points to choose from. Obviously, the bigger the zone, the quicker the camera will focus because there'll be more focus points for the camera to choose from. From my experience, this is a preferred way to shoot when you are in a fast-paced environment. So again, a good example, just walking through a busy street and there is people jumping out either side, there's loads going on, and you have to react very quickly. Because in those scenarios, I would rather be, let's say, 90% in focus, but at least get the image, rather than use spot and be 100% in focus, but have a much higher risk of completely missing the shot because the camera might take too long to focus because there's a lot going on. Another way to put this is that spot focusing is a lot more accurate, but a lot less responsive. So you can get a very accurate in-focus image, but the chance of you getting it in a, let's say, fast-paced environment is less. Whereas zone is a lot more responsive, but obviously it's a little bit less accurate. So you would use that when getting the shot is more important than having it 100% in focus. Okay, before wrapping up, a couple of points to mention. So first and foremost, many autofocus systems will have a custom feature where you can change the behavior of the autofocus. So on the Fuji cameras, you have a bunch of different options depending on what subject type you're shooting. I've played around with it a little bit, I've tried it, and just in my experience, I found that the default that the camera set to was the best, which I guess why it's the default. But by all means, experiment and see if the other options work for you. And finally, again, on the Fuji's, but I'm sure other cameras should have it as well, is you can then tell the camera whether to wait for the focus to be acquired or whether to take the photo before the focus is 100% acquired. For my type of work, I've put it to only take a photo when the focus is acquired because I don't really want a blurry photo because it'll go in the bin regardless. However, I'm sure if you're doing, let's say, journalism or sports or whatever it is where even if it's out of focus, it's important for you to have it, then you can change that to a release priority rather than a focus priority. Okay, that is all. Hopefully this was a quick video. Honestly, there's not a huge amount to cover when it comes to focusing, at least compared to the exposure videos that I've done previously. By now, I think I've covered all the main aspects from the camera control, at least for photography. So future videos, we'll be talking about other aspects that will help you out. As always, if you like the video, please do consider giving it a like. It helps it reach more people in the future. If you have your own thoughts, of course, please write them down in the comments. And that's it. Thank you ever so much for watching my videos and this video, and I hope you have a good day. Stay safe, it's been emotional, and I'll see you in a bit. Bye.